All right, buckle up everyone, because today on the deep dive, we're getting into something you probably don't think about too much.
But definitely should.
Exactly. We're talking building codes and standards, but not just any building codes.
Oh, no.
Specifically in Australia, and even more specifically, we're focusing on those low-rise commercial buildings.
Your shops, restaurants, even schools.
Exactly. And the really cool thing about this deep dive is we're working from actual training materials used for builders working towards a certification.
So we're giving you the inside scoop.
Yeah, no more guessing games, right? We'll break it all down.
Absolutely. And whether you're dreaming of starting your own construction project, or you're just curious about how things work, or, hey, maybe you're a total building code enthusiast,
We got you covered.
let's decode this thing together.
Yeah, let's decode the NCC, the National Construction Code, and see how it makes sure our buildings are safe, functional, and, well,
Not falling apart.
exactly. So, first things first, can we just get a simple explanation of what the NCC actually is?
Okay, so imagine this. A giant rule book.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
And this rule book, it's not just suggestions, it's the law.
Oh, wow. So it's serious business.
It gets updated every 3 years, and it dictates how every single new building in Australia,
Every single one.
every single one has to be built. This is how they ensure that no matter where you are in Australia, whether it's Sydney or Perth,
Or somewhere in between.
exactly, buildings meet certain standards. We're talking health, safety, accessibility, even how sustainable they are.
So it's basically like a safety net.
That's a great way to put it, and it makes sure buildings aren't, death traps
Yeah, nobody wants that.
or completely inaccessible.
Right, right.
But I know what you're thinking. This sounds super complicated and overwhelming.
Well, yeah, a little bit.
But here's the thing that makes this deep dive really cool. The NCC is what we call performance-based.
Performance-based, what does that even mean?
Okay, so instead of saying you must use this specific material for your walls, it says this is how strong your walls need to be.
Ah, so it's more about outcomes than rigid rules.
You got it. So builders and designers have some freedom.
They can get a little creative.
Exactly, to figure out how to achieve those outcomes.
Yeah, makes sense. So it's not just a giant list of thou shalt nots.
Definitely not.
That's good to know. But how does the NCC even begin to categorize all the different types of buildings out there? I mean, you've got everything from tiny little shops to massive skyscrapers.
Right. It's a lot.
Yeah. So how do they make sense of it all?
Well, it all comes down to risk. You see, the NCC isn't just about how big a building is.
It's about what's happening inside.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Imagine a library packed to the brim with books.
Oh, so many books.
Right. Now picture a gym, same size, but full of sweaty people.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Both the same size, but the fire risk, totally different.
Oh, I get it. Because all those books, that's like a tinderbox waiting to happen.
Exactly. So the NCC classifies buildings based on what they're used for,
Right?
how much flammable stuff is inside. We call that fire load.
Oh, that makes sense.
How many people are usually in there, and even how mobile those people are.
Wait, how mobile?
Like, are they sleeping like in a hotel or alert and moving around in an office?
Oh, interesting. So a multi-story apartment building with lots of people sleeping, that would probably have stricter rules than a single-story shop.
You got it. And then things get even trickier when you have buildings with mixed uses.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Like, picture a building with a shop on the ground floor and then apartments above.
Okay.
Even though those are technically two different classifications,
Right.
the whole building usually has to meet the stricter standards of the apartments.
Oh, because of the potential risk from downstairs.
Exactly. Better safe than sorry.
Absolutely.
Anyway.
Especially when people's homes are involved. So it's like this whole careful dance of assessing risk and then adjusting the rules.
You're getting it.
Okay, but how does the NCC actually ensure that builders are following these rules and that all these different buildings are, constructed safely and meet those specific requirements?
Well, that's where Volume 1 of the NCC comes in.
Okay, Volume 1. Tell me more.
This is where we get into the nitty-gritty of construction compliance.
Okay.
It's all organized into these different sections: governing requirements, performance requirements, verification methods, and then performance solutions.
Oh, my brain just did a backflip.
And those performance solutions, they can even include what we call deemed to satisfy provisions.
Hold on. Can we just break that down a bit? What does all that actually mean for someone who's, trying to actually build something?
Okay, good point. Let's simplify it.
Yeah.
Think of performance requirements as the what.
Wait.
Yeah, like the NCC is saying your wall needs to be able to resist fire for this long,
Oh, I see.
or people with disabilities need to be able to get into this area easily.
So it's setting the goals.
Exactly. for what the building needs to achieve.
Got it.
Then you have your solutions, which are the how.
Okay, so that's how you actually make it happen.
Right. And there are a couple of ways you can go about it. You can have a performance solution where you basically come up with your own unique method.
So it's not in the rule book, but you can prove it works.
Exactly. As long as you can demonstrate it meets those requirements.
That's really cool. It allows for some innovation.
Right. Or you can go with a deemed to satisfy provision.
Deemed to satisfy.
Yeah, which is basically like taking the NCC's pre-approved method, a tried and true solution.
So there's flexibility, but also a safety net.
Exactly. You got it.
But how do you even know which performance requirements apply to your project in the first place? I mean, it seems like there's so many variables to consider, like where the building is, what it's being used for.
It's a lot.
Right.
A lot.
Well, the NCC thankfully isn't a one-size-fits-all kind of deal.
All right, good.
It actually walks you through specific steps to figure out what applies to your specific project.
Okay.
And it takes into account everything. The building's classification, how many stories it has.
Right. The type of construction, how big it is, even what climate zone it's being built in.
Wait, so climate matters too?
Oh, yeah, big time.
Huh, I wouldn't have thought of that.
In fact, our source material gives this great example of a primary school in Mernda.
Mernda.
Yeah, it's a suburb of Melbourne.
Okay.
And they walk us through how they figured out which performance requirements applied to that specific school.
And being in a particular climate zone, that actually influenced things like the fire safety requirements.
Exactly. It all plays a role.
Wow, this is making me realize how much thought goes into every single detail of building codes. It's not just about throwing up some walls and hoping for the best.
Absolutely not. You're right. There's a lot of careful consideration that goes into it.
Makes sense, yeah. And it's probably why you don't want to mess around with building codes on your own, right?
Oh, definitely not. This is not DIY territory.
Okay, good to know.
You really need those qualified professionals like architects and engineers.
People who really know their stuff.
Exactly. Because they understand all the nuances and they can make sure the building is not just compliant, but truly safe and functional.
Okay, so we've covered classification, compliance requirements. What's next on our deep dive into the NCC?
Let's move on to a topic that's always top of mind, especially when it comes to buildings. Fire protection.
Okay, fire protection. Everyone wants to know about that.
Right. And the first thing to understand is that the NCC isn't about making buildings completely fireproof.
Because that's probably impossible, right?
Yeah, in most cases, it's just not realistic.
Okay.
It's more about strategically minimizing the risk.
Damage control.
Yeah, and also maximizing safety, so making sure people can get out if a fire does happen.
So it's all about giving people enough time to escape safely and then also limiting the damage to the building itself and anything nearby.
You got it. 2 birds, 1 stone.
But how does the NCC actually measure a building's ability to withstand a fire? Like, I'm picturing some dramatic fire tests.
No, you're not far off.
Oh, really?
We have something called the FRL,
The FRL.
which stands for Fire Resistance Level.
Okay.
And it's basically a measure of how long a building element, like a wall or a door,
Okay.
can hold up against fire before it fails.
So some materials can withstand fire longer than others?
Exactly.
That seems like pretty crucial information to have.
Oh, it is. And the FRL, it measures 3 main things.
Okay, lay it on me.
First, we have structural adequacy.
Structural adequacy.
Structural adequacy, okay.
So can the element still hold itself up under fire conditions?
Okay, so it doesn't just crumble.
Exactly. Second, integrity,
Integrity.
meaning can it stop those flames and hot gases from getting through?
So it acts like a barrier.
Right. And finally, insulation.
So how well it prevents the heat from transferring through.
You're on a roll.
So a wall with a high FRL, it wouldn't just stay standing, it would also help to contain the fire and protect whoever's on the other side.
Precisely. That's the goal. That's incredible. But I imagine these FRL requirements aren't just, random numbers pulled out of a hat. How do they actually determine how much fire resistance is needed?
That's where it gets really interesting. It all depends on a bunch of factors.
Okay, like what?
Well, you've got the building's classification, what materials they use to build it,
Yep.
and even the location of the building itself. Like our source material gives this example of figuring out the FRL for an external wall on a 2-story restaurant.
Okay.
And a key factor was how close that wall was to the property boundary.
So if the restaurant was right next to another building, They'd need a higher fire resistance rating.
Exactly, to stop the fire from spreading.
That makes sense. It's like a domino effect you're trying to prevent.
Right, and this is where the NCC gets even more clever, because they use a combination of what we call active and passive fire control elements.
Okay, active and passive. What's the difference?
Well, active elements are things that actually activate during a fire.
Like they spring into action.
Exactly. Think sprinklers, alarms, all that good stuff.
Oh, okay, that makes sense.
And then you have your passive elements,
Okay.
which are the built-in features that are always there, quietly working to slow down or contain the fire.
So things like fire-rated walls and doors.
Exactly. So it's like a 1-2 punch against fire.
I like that analogy. You've got your first responders, the active elements, and then you have the passive elements holding the line.
Exactly. Giving people more time to escape.
That brings up an important question, though. What about buildings that already exist?
Oh, good point.
Like, how do they fit into these modern fire safety standards? You can't just rebuild every old building.
Right. And that's where essential safety measures, or ESMs, come into play.
ESMs. Fill me in. What are those?
Think of ESMs as the practical, on-the-ground measures that keep those existing buildings safe in case of a fire. And our source material gets really specific.
Okay, love the specifics.
For instance, you know those fire extinguishers and hose reels you see in buildings?
Oh, yeah, they're everywhere.
Well, are they the right type for the potential fire hazards in that building? Have they been inspected? Are they up to date?
Honestly, I don't even know how to check if a fire extinguisher is up to date.
It's something we all tend to forget about, but it's so important.
Yeah, probably should pay more attention to those things.
And then you've got your smoke detectors and emergency lighting. Do you know how to test those?
I should probably brush up on that, too.
It's good to be prepared. And then there are fire doors. Those are the doors that are often propped open.
Which completely defeats the purpose.
Exactly. They need to be properly labeled, have their seals intact, and they need to be in good working order. And of course, the escape paths need to be clear. No clutter blocking the exits.
It's amazing how these seemingly little details can make such a huge difference in an emergency.
Absolutely. Oh, and speaking of things we should be paying attention to, have you heard about the recent ban on certain combustible cladding materials in some buildings?
Oh, yeah, that was big news. I remember seeing those scary images of fires spreading up the sides of buildings.
Yeah, it was a wake-up call about the dangers of certain materials, and it really highlights how important it is to stay informed about building codes and safety regulations.
Yeah, it's not just about ticking boxes. It's about creating spaces where people can actually feel safe and secure.
Exactly. Can I tell you a bit more about those combustible cladding materials?
Please, I'm all ears. Like, what were they exactly, and why were they so dangerous?
Okay, so in recent years, there's been a lot of scrutiny on materials like aluminum composite panels, ACP for short,
ACP.
and expanded polystyrene, EPS.
EPS, got it.
They were super popular because they were lightweight and cost-effective.
So they were used everywhere.
Everywhere, but unfortunately they were also implicated in some really devastating fires.
Both here in Australia and internationally, right?
Exactly, and I think everyone remembers those news reports, the way the fire just raced up the sides of those buildings. It was terrifying.
Yeah, it was like something out of a movie.
The big issue is that these materials can ignite and burn incredibly quickly, and then it creates this chimney effect that allows the fire to bypass any internal fire barriers and just spread rapidly up the outside of the building.
So even if a building has good internal fire safety features, the cladding itself could create a whole new path for the fire to spread.
Exactly, and it was a major concern because these materials were used in all kinds of buildings, both residential and commercial.
So what happened? Are these materials still allowed?
Thankfully, there was a big regulatory response.
Good, good.
Here in Australia, a lot of jurisdictions have implemented bans or really strict restrictions on using ACP and EPS in certain types of construction.
That makes sense. But what about the buildings that were already built with these materials? What happens to them?
That's the tricky part.
Yeah, I can imagine.
There are ongoing efforts to identify and assess buildings with this type of cladding.
Okay.
And a lot of building owners are facing pressure to either remediate or completely replace these materials, which is a huge undertaking, both financially and logistically.
I bet.
But it really emphasizes just how crucial building codes are.
Right.
They're not static. They need to be constantly evolving to keep up with new knowledge and address emerging risks.
This has been so insightful. We've only just scratched the surface, but I already feel like I'm looking at buildings with a whole new level of awareness.
It's amazing what you discover when you start to peel back the layers of something as seemingly mundane as building codes, right?
I know. And before we move on, what stood out to you as the most important takeaway from our dive into the NCC so far?
For me, it's realizing that building codes aren't just about rules and regulations. They're really a commitment to safety, accessibility, and sustainability in our built environment.
Yeah, it's about protecting lives, minimizing those risks, and making sure our buildings serve us well.
Now and in the future.
Exactly, not just for today.
Right.
That's a really powerful way to think about it. It's not just about compliance. It's about creating spaces where people can really thrive and feel secure.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
It's like the NCC is giving us this secret decoder ring for understanding the world around us.
I like that analogy.
We've talked a lot about fire safety, but what about some of those other aspects you mentioned earlier, like accessibility and sustainability? How does the NCC address those?
Those are huge topics, and the NCC definitely doesn't shy away from them.
Okay, good.
Let's start with accessibility. The NCC has all these specific requirements to ensure that buildings are usable by people with disabilities.
Makes sense.
We're talking ramps, accessible toilets, and clear pathways for people using wheelchairs or who have mobility impairments.
Right, so everyone can get around easily.
Exactly. It even gets into things like visual cues and signage for people with vision impairments.
Wow, they've really thought of everything.
They try to cover all the bases.
That's impressive.
Right.
But what about sustainability? How does the NCC promote those eco-friendly building practices?
Well, there are a bunch of ways they do that.
Okay, like what?
For example, it promotes energy efficiency by setting standards for insulation, glazing, and ventilation.
So you don't have to rely as much on heating and cooling systems.
Exactly. Less energy consumption, which is good for the planet and good for your wallet.
Win-win.
Right. And it also encourages things like water-saving fixtures and appliances to reduce water consumption.
So it's not just about making buildings safe and accessible, it's also about making them environmentally responsible.
Exactly.
It's like the NCC is this holistic guide to good building practices.
That's a great way to put it.
This deep dive has been so eye-opening. I swear, I'm already noticing things about buildings that I never paid attention to before.
I bet our listener is feeling the same way.
They're probably walking around looking at fire exits and ramps with a whole new appreciation.
Right. It's like you suddenly have this insider knowledge.
Speaking of things we've learned, one thing that's really stood out to me is the importance of context.
Context, yeah.
Like how factors like building classification, location, even the climate, all play a role in the specific requirements for a project.
You're absolutely right. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
No, definitely not. Every building is unique, and the NCC recognizes that.
It does. It's more like a framework that can be applied to all sorts of scenarios.
Yeah.
But it also allows for flexibility and adaptation to meet the specific needs of each project.
So it's like a set of guidelines, but also a toolbox for builders and designers to come up with innovative solutions.
Exactly. As long as they still meet those essential safety and performance standards, of course.
Right, of course.
Yeah.
That's a pretty cool balance.
It is. And it highlights how collaborative the building process really is.
In what way?
Well, you have architects, engineers, builders, even the building owners.
Okay.
They all need to work together, using their expertise and their understanding of the NCC to create buildings that are both functional and compliant.
It's like a symphony of knowledge and skills all coming together.
I love that. A symphony of building.
And for someone like me who doesn't have a background in construction, it's reassuring to know that there's this system in place, guided by the NCC, to make sure that those buildings are safe, accessible, and sustainable.
It definitely takes some of the guesswork out of it.
But let's be honest, most people probably don't spend their days thinking about building codes.
Right.
So what would you say to someone who's wondering why they should even care about this stuff?
I think it's easy to take for granted the spaces we inhabit every day.
We just assume they're safe.
Yeah, we kind of just trust that someone else is taking care of all the safety and functionality of our homes, offices, and public spaces.
Like we're on autopilot.
Right. But I think understanding even a little bit about building codes can really empower us as citizens and consumers.
Oh, I like that. How so? Can you give me some examples?
Sure. For example, imagine you're planning a renovation on your home.
Okay.
Knowing about the NCC can help you understand what's actually possible and what permits you might need to get.
That's a good point, so you don't run into any surprises down the line.
Exactly. Or let's say you're renting an apartment.
Okay.
You can ask your landlord questions about the building's compliance with fire safety and accessibility standards.
So you know you're living in a safe and accessible space.
Right. And even if you're just walking around the street, being aware of these codes can help you notice potential hazards or appreciate the thoughtfulness that goes into creating a truly accessible and functional space.
It's like having this secret decoder ring for the built environment. So you
Exactly.
start seeing things you never noticed before.
And you can ask more informed questions about the spaces you're occupying.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
But beyond individual awareness, is there a broader social impact to understanding building codes?
Oh, absolutely. I think building codes are a reflection of our societal values and priorities.
Okay, I see what you mean.
They embody our commitment to safety, accessibility, and sustainability.
Right.
And as our understanding of these issues evolves, so too do our building codes.
Like it's an ongoing conversation.
Exactly. The recent scrutiny of combustible cladding materials is a perfect example of this.
Yeah, that was a big turning point.
It was. It really brought the issue of building safety into the spotlight.
And forced us to reevaluate our standards and practices.
Exactly. It's a good reminder that these codes aren't just static documents.
They're living, breathing things.
They are. They're constantly adapting to address new challenges and ensure the well-being of our communities.
And as citizens, we have a role to play in shaping those codes.
We do.
Like we can stay informed about proposed changes, voice our concerns,
Exactly.
advocate for higher standards.
It's a reminder that we're not just passive occupants of our built environment.
We can actually shape it for the better.
We can.
This has been such a fascinating journey. We've gone from decoding the basics of the NCC
I know. It's amazing how far we've come.
to exploring its impact on everything from accessibility and sustainability to individual awareness and social change. It's amazing how interconnected everything is.
It really is.
But before we wrap up our deep dive, I have one final question for you.
Okay, shoot.
If you could leave our listener with just one key takeaway from our exploration of building codes, what would it be?
I would say this. Building codes are more than just technical documents.
Okay.
They represent a collective effort to create a built environment that is safe, equitable, and sustainable for everyone.
So it's about people.
It's about people. They embody our values and aspirations as a society.
Yeah, it's not just about bricks and mortar. It's about creating spaces where people can thrive and feel safe and connected.
Absolutely.
I have to say, I'm feeling pretty inspired right now.
You do.
Who knew that a deep dive into building codes could be so thought-provoking?
It's all about perspective, right?
It is.
Once you start to see the world through the lens of building codes, you realize just how much they impact our everyday lives.
In ways we don't even think about.
Exactly. And the more we understand about them, the more empowered we are to actually participate in shaping the built environment around us.
So what's our final takeaway for our listeners today? What do we want them to walk away with after joining us on this deep dive into building codes?
If I had to sum it all up, I'd say this. Building codes. They're like the silent guardians of our built environment.
I like that.
They're constantly working behind the scenes, making sure that everything is safe, accessible, and, built to last.
And even though we might not always think about them,
Right.
they're playing a huge role in shaping the spaces we inhabit every single day.
Every single day.
Beautifully said. And for our listener, I hope this deep dive has sparked some curiosity about the buildings around you.
Yeah, get curious.
Maybe you'll start noticing those fire exits a little more closely, or appreciating the ramps and accessible features that make buildings more inclusive for everyone.
And maybe even feel a sense of gratitude for the people who make it all happen.
Oh, yeah. All those architects, engineers, builders,
Yeah.
policymakers,
The unsung heroes of the built environment.
working tirelessly to make sure that our buildings are safe, functional, and sustainable.
Absolutely.
It's a good reminder that we're all connected, in a way,
We are.
even through those seemingly mundane structures that surround us.
They tell a story.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the fascinating world of building codes. I don't know about you, but I'm feeling a whole lot more knowledgeable.
Me too.
And maybe even a little bit more empowered to appreciate and even advocate for a better built environment.
I love that.
It's been a pleasure diving deep with you today.
Likewise.
And to our amazing listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey of discovery.
Yes, thank you.
We hope you've enjoyed the ride
We had a blast.
and that you'll join us again for our next deep dive into a new and fascinating topic.
We've got some great ones lined up.
Until then, keep those minds curious and stay tuned for more insightful explorations.
See you next time.